Good afternoon, folks. Those of you who are interested in cycling, like myself, would be aware of the phenomenal success of the British Olympic cycling team and the equivalent success of the Sky cycling team in the Tour de France, in winning 3 Tour de France titles over the last 5 years. And I'm sure that you've also will have heard of the high performance director, or some of you will have, of the British team, David Brailsford. I think he's now known as Sir Dave Brailsford. And the success of Brailsford is quite legendary, in that when he was appointed initially as a consultant to the British cycling team, I think it was in 1997, they won 1 gold medal in the time trial at the Olympics the following year. And in 2004, 1 year after he was appointed the high performance director, they won another gold medal. They won 2 gold medals, rather. 4 years later, in the Beijing Olympics, they won an astonishing 8 golds, and then repeated that feat in the London Olympics in 2012. So the success of Brailsford is quite legendary. And at the same time, something more remarkable was happening, because while he was preparing the cycling team in 2009 for the Olympics, he also set up the new team, Team Sky. And on the day that team was announced to the world, he stated that they would win the Tour de France within 5 years. And an awful lot of people laughed at that assertion, because the Tour de France, I think it started in 1903, and Britain had never won it in all that period, or never even come close to winning. But Bradley Wiggins in 2012 won the first Tour de France 3 years ahead of schedule, and in the last 3 years Chris Froome won it twice, so 3 titles in the team. And these are regarded probably as some of the most extraordinary recent sporting achievements in recent sporting history. And Matthew Saeed, who was referred to earlier, I think, by one of the speakers, he was a former Olympian and award-winning sports journalist who wrote the very successful and insightful book called Bounce, and I'm sure some of you will have read it, which talks about what it takes to be the best. Has also written another book recently called Black Box Thinking, and in it he devotes a chapter to Brailsford and the success and how he achieved the success. And when he interviewed him and asked him, you know, how he achieved such groundbreaking success, Brailsford replied, and he said it was all down to marginal gains. And again, that has been mentioned earlier, I think, by Jeff Linsky. And the idea that if you break down a big goal into small component parts and focus on improving each of those component parts by even 1%, then the cumulative effect of all of those improvements can be staggering. And for example, in attempting to discover the most efficient training methods, Brailsford, he created new data sets which tracked each cyclist, the subcomponents of each cyclist's physiological performance. In the Tour de France, they transport the mattresses to the team hotels for each of the cyclists in advance of every stage, to ensure that the cyclists sleep on the same mattress every night, to ensure a marginal gain in the quality of their sleep. And they vacuum the rooms a half an hour before they arrive in each room to reduce the risk of infection. Now, they're just some examples of some of the things that they've done to generate those marginal gains which have made the difference. Now, of course, while it's much easier to do that in a professional environment where you have full-time coaches, full-time athletes, great resources, nevertheless it got me thinking, how can we in the GAA, as coaches, most of us involved in clubs, apply that concept to the way we develop our players and develop our teams, even in an amateur context? Because I think, as it's been said many times already today, most of us here well, we're all practically volunteer amateur coaches, most involved in clubs. But we all want to improve, we all want to be the best that we can be, we all want to climb new mountains every year. And as coaches and as players as well, they demand that we're at the top of our game in all aspects of preparation, be it tactics, technique, physical, mental preparation, plus organising games, plus reviewing the opposition, plus reviewing the DVDs, and the myriad of all the other tasks that are involved in managing a team and in coaching a team. And the reality is that as amateurs, most of us have limited time to devote to coaching and limited contact with players. And to me, based on my own experience, it's almost impossible to devote all the time you want to everything you want to do to prepare your team as well as possible. And that's why, and certainly when I look at my own club coaching career, there are years where, when I look back, I tried to do everything, and perhaps did everything reasonably okay, but didn't or neglected to focus on the things that were going to make the biggest marginal gains, the biggest difference. I think certainly if I was doing it again, I would concentrate on a smaller number of things that would make the very big differences. And I think if you apply that concept, and if you're coaching a team over 2 or 3 years, and you focus on those areas that you think are going to make the big differences over that period, well then you can develop a really high-performing team over that period. Because the reality is, as we all know, success isn't just about winning titles. A number of you will win titles with your clubs this year or with the teams that you're involved in. Most of you won't, but by the law of averages. But success is about making progress. And I think one of the things that we have to look at is, and ask the question at the end of the year, and if you ask your players, those of you who are involved in managing a team, if you look at the end of the year and look backwards, and as part of your end of season review, ask your players those 3 questions. Have I developed as a player? Have we developed and improved as a team? And has the training, the coaching been educational, enjoyable and challenging? And if you get a yes answer to all of those questions, well then you're doing a good coaching job. And if you can, over a 2 or 3 year period, ask those questions, and if you get a yes answer to those 3 questions over that 3 year period, well then you're very close to, if not, winning titles. So, the question, where can the marginal gains occur? Well, I think Dr. Liam Hennessy and Jeff Linsky both this morning talked about core values and having values as a coach. And if one of your core values is to create that learning opportunity or that learning environment that Jeff talked about a while ago, where you're trying to develop players, if that's one of your core values, well then player development should be at the centre of your coaching plan. And of course, one of the key roles of the coach is to develop a player and the way the player plays the game. And there are 4 areas, and I know Pat has the O2 model and the three T's, the 3 P's, but there are essentially 4 areas of development. You have the tactical side, which is decision making, technical technique, the fitness side, and the mental side of the game. Again, in my own personal view, I think to pull all of that together, even in a club environment, it's important to have a development coordinator. Now that can be the head coach, yourself, it can be one of your assistants, it can be somebody in an administration role within the club. But it puts the focus on the player at the centre of the coaching plan. And you plan the player's progress at the start of the year, and then the development coordinator, their role then can be to pull everything together, to monitor, to assess, to see if the player is making progress throughout the year, and ensure that the player is getting the appropriate feedback as the year goes on also. So to me, that's a critical role in helping you as head coaches, as senior coaches in your respective with your respective teams, pull it all together and make sure the player is improving throughout the year. Because individual player development isn't just about developing a player technically, it's about taking a more holistic approach. Sorry, I'll go back here. It's about taking a more holistic approach to overall player development. And to give you an example of what I mean by that, it's a game that I was involved in a few years ago, and some of you will I'm sure this might resonate with you. And if you can picture the situation, we were a couple of points up with a minute to go, and the young 21-year-old wing back won a free on the right-hand side of the field, around right midfield position, and he kicked the free back to the captain, who was shouting for the ball in the centre-half back position. And the kick was inaccurate, and it went closer to midfield, 5 metres away from the target. And instead of the ball going to the centre-back uncontested, it became a contest. And in the contest, the back lost the ball. 10 seconds later, 2 passes later, the ball was in the back of the net, and we lost the game by a point. So the question is, why did it happen? And in assessing why it happened, you have to look at, or why did the kick miss the target, you have to look at the 4 areas, not just one. So from a technical or a tactical point of view, the first piece was the player under pressure either forgot or decided not to go with the game plan. And the game plan was to, in a situation like that, where you're a couple of points up with a minute to go long into the corner forward position, to create a contest up there, try and retain the ball, but even if you lose the ball as a team, well then the opposition is 130 metres away from the goal, and they're going to find it very, very difficult to score in limited time. So tactically, it missed the target. Technically, poor ball-to-foot technique. So in dropping the ball to the foot, he was inaccurate, and he didn't follow through on the kick. So his technique was poor. Third element, tiredness. At the end of the game, an old saying, as your stamina fails, often your skill lessens. So at the end of the game, as the player was tired, young player, well then that can result in a deficiency in skill. And the final element, the mental side, he wasn't mentally strong enough to ignore the captain who was screaming for the ball. Okay? So, traditionally, maybe in the past, how would we have dealt with that as coaches? Well, we might have said to the player, if you're ever in that position again, you give the ball to somebody else to take the free. All right? So don't take the free again. No, that's not so good development. Or we might have said to the player, go out and practice your kicking, your free kicking, a number of times, 200 or 300 times every evening, so that the next time you're in that situation, you'll hit the pass accurately. But the reality is that won't develop the player either, because he needed development in those 4 areas. And indeed, the captain needed a bit of development as well, because he abandoned the game plan at a critical situation. So how do we do that? Again, Jeff, and I'm covering all ground, Jeff Linsky talked about this. How do you do that, and how as coaches do you develop that at the next team meeting or the next training session? You bring them in, you talk through it. What happened? Get their feedback. Ask those open questions. How were you feeling when that happened? What made you do that? And re-emphasize the game plan. The importance of it, what you do in that situation, so that they're very clear when they leave the meeting. And then, very importantly, and most importantly, when you go out on the training ground, you practice the scenarios in game-based situations, in the small-sided games that are a big part of that, big part of the GAA coaching ethos now. So, and rehearse and repeat those, put them in those situations over and over again. What do we do when we're 3 minutes to go and we're 2 points ahead? What do we do when there's a minute to go and we're 3 points behind or 2 points behind? And what do we do when the opposition has the ball? So to practice those scenarios over and over again so that they become natural in that situation with a minute to go in the real life situation. So a large part of the player development can occur and look after itself to a certain extent if the training and the games-based situations in training and the game plan continually challenge the player. Some of you before might have heard me talk about an Australian coach, and on the subject of defending a lead, which we're covering now, an Australian coach, a famous coach called Rick Charlesworth, who's currently working with the Australian Institute of Sport as a coach mentor, a professional coach mentor to a number of professional coaches, full-time coaches in the Australian Rules League, in hockey and in cricket, international hockey and international cricket. But his greatest achievements, however, were back in 2003 when he took over the Australian ladies hockey team. And in the next 8 years, he brought them to win 2 Olympic titles, 2 World Cups, and the Commonwealth Games. And he also coached the Australian men's hockey team, I think it was 2014, to win the World Cup in Holland, beating the hosts 6-1 in the final. This is a guy that's actually coached teams in 25 major finals and won 24 of them. He has only lost 1 major game in 14 years of coaching at elite level. So he has a phenomenal record, and it was somebody that I certainly wanted to talk to and hear more about. So before the International Rules Test match or Test Series in 2014, I wrote to him because I knew he was based in Perth, and asked him would he meet me and would he talk to our players in advance of the test match, and delighted when he accepted, and he spoke to us and gave us some fantastic insights into his approach to coaching and what made him successful. And in his book, which is called The Coach, there it is, Managing for Success, he talks about the story of how he developed the teams to be so successful. And in that book, he devotes a chapter which is called Never Defend a Lead. And he talks about his philosophy as a coach in that he points out that the way that he's wary of coaches and players who change the way they play coming towards the end of a game based on the scoreboard. And one of the points he makes, or a few points that he makes, is that leading can be as difficult as being behind, because what can often happen is that the players start to think about the outcome of the game, this outcome obsession, as opposed to thinking about the process. And the process is, what do we need to continue to do for the rest of the game to ensure that we get the result? And the process has been honed in many hours of training sessions and coaching sessions and reviews and meetings, over the last while. So, and his view is that when a team is so determined or trying to protect the lead, they become so determined about defending that sometimes they forget about attack. And when that happens, they often lose structure and form. And when they lose structure and form, the team sometimes disintegrates. And I'll come back to that because I have an example of it in a second. And his strategy was simple and uncomplicated. It was that he wanted his teams to play relentlessly all the time, to play with a very high tempo from the word go, and try and fracture the opposition belief as early as possible and their game plan. And if they went 3 goals up after 15 minutes, they wanted to go 6 up. And if they went 2 goals up with 5 minutes to go, they wanted to get another goal. Or if they went a goal behind, they redoubled their efforts to get it back as quickly as possible. So play relentlessly all the time. And to prepare the team for that situation, we're going back to the games-based approach here again. At almost every training session, he required his team's players to play small-sided games under fatigue, towards the end of the sessions often, under fatigue, and sometimes had an imbalance in the team. It might have been 7 against 5 or whatever it was, or 2 goals to defend. And in that way, at every session, he prepared them for whatever was going to happen in the big games, in the Olympic finals, the World Cup finals. Now, I'd imagine that most of you probably will have played in games like that, where you're a couple of points behind, and you lost by a goal, late goal, or you won by a late goal. And there's some great examples over the years, and probably the most famous of them all, and apologies to any Kerry people that are here, is the famous 1982 final when Offaly got the last-minute goal to deny Kerry that famous 5 in a row. And we might just play that one, just to remind us.
This is Liam Connor, the fullback, a high lobbing, dropping ball, in towards the goal line, a shot, a goal for Offaly. There was a goal in the game, a goal.
Okay, now, good to see it again for the Offaly people that are here in the audience, obviously. But just to think about what happened, Kerry went 4 points ahead, and I know some of you here will probably not have been born when that game went on. But Kerry went 4 points ahead with a number of minutes to go, 6 or 7 minutes to go. And Offaly got a couple of frees, and it came back to a 2-point game, and I think there might have been 2 minutes to go. And as I said, everyone remembers the famous Seamus Darby goal, but the question really is, did Kerry contribute to that happening? Or what did they do? Maybe subconsciously to contribute to that happening. And if we look at it again, and we'll click it in a second, what they did is subconsciously they may have gone into defensive mode, because what happened was the full forward line dropped back towards the half line, and the half line dropped back towards the midfield. Okay? The concertina effect. And when we see it again here in the replay, we'll see one of the midfielders actually was behind the full back line when they got the goal. So, of course, the law of unintended consequences. When you drop back, when one player decides to go defensive in that situation, or a couple of other players decide to go with them because they'll fill the gaps, what happens? It brings the opponents forward. And when you look at it again, we'll show it again, it was the Offaly number 3, the late Liam Connor, full-back, who kicked the ball in from the midfield position, the pass that ended up being won inside and got the goal. So we'll have a look at it again. Now, these were some of the greatest, the Kerry players were some of the greatest players ever to play the game. But going back to Rick Charlesworth's point there about what happens when you go into defensive mode, a team can lose structure very quickly. And all it takes is one player to do that. And then when you lose structure, as I said, things can fall apart. So the message for us, I suppose, as coaches is, and we hear a lot of talked about the last couple of years, is having a clear and a very, very clear and firm structure to our team and to our game plan that carries us right through to the 70th minute or the 73rd or 4th or 5th minute or whatever the case might be, is very important, and we don't deviate from that in an ideal situation. Let's have just another area, look at another area where, actually before I say that, that same man, to deviate from the presentation for a moment, Rick Charlesworth was over here during the summer and attended his very first Gaelic football match, and it happened to be the All-Ireland semi-final, and he was a guest of Pat Daly, the All-Ireland semi-final between Kerry and Offaly. And his first observation to me after the game, the very first thing he said to me, he says, it's impossible for one referee to referee that game. He says, the game is so fast, it's so dynamic, it's a big pitch, there's so much going on around the field of play. He said, it is impossible, he says. And he made the point to me that in the AFL, this year, they're trialling 4 field referees, or umpires they call it, 4 field referees this year, going up from 3 to 4. And even though it's a bigger pitch, we know that, but the reason is that they want their referees to be within 25 or 30 metres of the play of the ball at all times, so that they're in a position to make a better decision. So it's a view that personally I have shared for a number of years, because I think it is too difficult for one referee, and I think the players deserve it as well. But anyway, that's an aside. But back to the main topic, and let's have a look at another area in which a hugely important area for coaches, and that's in the teaching of skill in terms of player development. And traditionally, techniques have been taught before decision making, but if we accept that a decision has to be made before a skill is executed, well then maybe we should think about coaching decision making before skill. Teach how you do it before what you do. And I like this definition of skill where I heard before, it says, skill is decision making supported by technique. And in his book, The Art of Coaching, an AFL coach called David Whedon wrote that there are 5 skills involved in good decision making by a player. First one is reading the play, and reading the play involves recognizing what's happening, what has happened, what's happening around him, predicting what's going to happen, and then making a decision. The second one then is positioning. The player being aware on his field of play, on the field, where he is in relation to where the ball is and where his teammates are and where the opponents are. And I know Damien Young had a session on this previously that a few of you might have been at, and he would have covered some of this area. Timing is a crucial element of it. Third area, very, very important. Making your intervention, timing your skill at the exact appropriate, the important time to make the difference. Communication. Again, somebody talked about it earlier on. In Croke Park, it's very hard to hear. So the communication can't always be verbal. It might be visual. And you recognize the visual cues from playing with your players at training and whatnot. And the final element that brings it all together is your tactical knowledge. You've got to know your game plan. You've got to know the opposition's game plan as closely as possible, and the strengths and weaknesses of both. So, and a priority for all players, older and younger, should be to develop decision making. And you can do that again, not in isolated situations, but through your game-based approach, and in practicing and rehearsing different situations or scenarios in those games, in games of training. So let's have a look at a couple of examples of decision making in action. And the first one I'm going to show is a clip of one of the best team goals in the last year's championship. It was scored by Donegal against Galway in the last round of the qualifiers by Ryan McHugh. We might have a look at this here.
McElhenney was the initial target. Now they opt to just knock it down because they've got players waiting for it. McNeilish guided beautifully to McFadden. Steered in there towards Murphy. Touchdown! And Ryan McHugh puts it in the back of the net. And there's a second goal tonight for Donegal. and that might be enough. Beautifully worked move here, right down through the centre from the kick-off, and in eventually from Murphy's tip down to the lively 21-year-old Ryan McHugh, who makes it 2-9 to 9 points.
What we saw there was, if you remember, great reading of the play by McNeilish when he won it, the ball out around midfield. Great positional sense from McFadden because he made the run, he made the run from the corner forward position out towards the half line to win the ball. Clearly there was good communication from Murphy because as the ball was being kicked in, I think everyone knew what he was going to do, and communication between him and Ryan McHugh, who scored the goal, the timing of the run was so important. So if you look at those 4 areas, they were addressed very, very successfully, the decision-making process, in that particular example. All right? So we'll look at it in slow motion in a second. Just hold it for a second. Because decision-making is a kind of a term that's bandied about by everybody. But I'm not so sure that we all know what's involved. And the reality is that there is a process involved in it. So that if we're going to coach it to our players, we need to understand what are the elements of decision-making and to break it down in the same way as we break our skills and our technical training or coaching down to players. And there are 5 elements in it. Perception, the player, and think of it from the context of Ryan McHugh, who scored the goal. I'll come back to him in a second. Perception. When something is happening, when a play is developing, a player has to be aware of what's going on. What's happening here? Where am I on the field of play? Where's my opponent? Can I influence this play now? So that's perception and awareness. The concentration of the player then has got to narrow. We all hear about the concept of, a very clear focus. So it has to narrow that, what am I going to do next? And then the third element is you make the decision. And the decision in that case was, I'll go hard towards the goal. Once he makes the decision and he gets the ball or he's involved in the play, fourth element is he's got to execute well. And the final piece is that once he does it, he gets the immediate feedback himself. Because if he does it well, he knows, I've executed really well. And remember in that situation what he did was, he was 1-on-1 with the keeper, he picked a spot, and he kind of side-footed into the roof of the net. So if he's in that situation again, he might do the same thing because he's had a successful outcome and the feedback is very positive. If he went low, straight at the keeper, and he blocked it with the legs, well, maybe he's thinking to himself, right, next time I'll do it differently. All right? So there are the elements. So let's have a look at it again in slow motion. And I want you just to focus on where McHugh starts his role. There he is. You can see him there. Okay? So when McNeilish gets the ball, he's made the decision. He's aware of what's happening, and he's made the run. Okay? Now, and you see he's got 30 metres of space. So he can either get the pass, he's still in 15 metres of space. There he is again, okay? And he finishes. Okay, so go back to your decision-making model. Perception was strong. Concentration was great. He made the decision very quickly. He had to look around, where are my teammates, where are my markers, and he's gone. So, great example of good decision-making. Okay? Now, if you were a Galway coach, you might look at it a bit differently, because you might question the decision-making of some of your players in the Galway team. Because if it was to allow him to run freely through the middle, if it was a one-off, if that had never happened before in a game, you mightn't be too hard on them. But didn't he do the same thing twice against Dublin in the All-Ireland semi-final the previous year? Made those runs from midfield that nobody picked up. So it's not as if in the planning for the game that wouldn't probably have been highlighted. So you might be working on, at the next training session with your Galway team, you might be working on improving their decision-making and getting a better understanding of what they were thinking in that situation. Here's another example. And this is the Dublin goal versus Mayo in the All-Ireland final, first half of 2013, I think it is, yeah. And in this case, well, let's run it on again.
It was Alan Freeman, the number 14. Now Jack McCaffrey. They're trying to work it beyond Mayo's 65-metre line, and there's a tough, strong barrier of Mayo bodies confronting them. Finally, Paul Flynn kicks it long, hopefully in there, and it's in the net, and it's scored by Bernard Brogan. It was worth a putt. Knocked in long, and a goal that comes after 16 minutes ties up the match at 1-1 to 4 points. This huge one from about 65 metres out. Keeper Kane never...
Okay, all right. So, terrific play by... Okay, the long ball came in. It was the first long ball in the game. Might have been 20, 25 minutes into the first half. First long ball that came in. Brogan read it really well. He's the smaller of the three players inside and positioned his timing, the jump, the execution was top class. But if you were a defender, if you were looking at it from a Mayo point of view, you have two players defending, one forward, and they're taller. And no doubt both players would read the play and had read what was happening, maybe position themselves initially well, but if we look at it again, in a second, they will probably have been let down in the areas of timing, communication and execution, which are three critical areas of decision making. Because what do you want when you have two players, two defenders and one forward inside? What's the first thing you want is you want communication. You want one of them talking to the other. What else do you want? You want somebody breaking the ball aggressively away from the danger area. And you want to make sure that the timing of your jump is correct. So that was an area. So let's run it again. Yep. Let's run it again, just in slow motion. And again, remember, it was the first long ball in the game, so you know the defenders were probably used to the lower ball coming in at that stage. But this is just an example of what you might do as a coach when you're looking at your games or you're looking at your training sessions and reviewing, and how can you improve your players' decision making by looking at the actual instance and breaking down the process. So we'll stop it there, exactly there. Yeah. Okay. I think we got the idea. So we can see where these two defenders, the defender and the goalkeeper, are some of the best players in the country and have probably made a lot of better decisions or good decisions than poor decisions. But the objective was to show that how some elements of the process can break down. And when it happens in front of goal, it's an awful lot more penal than it happens out the field. Okay? So what might you do at the next training session if you're a coach and you're reviewing that to improve? You bring them in, discuss the play, review it, ask questions, ask those open questions. What happened? Get an understanding, make sure that they understand and that you're aware of what they were thinking at that stage, and how are you going to improve that? And are the players receptive to the learning and the improvement? And if they are, well then at the next session or straight afterwards you go out and you practice those scenarios again, the long ball in small-sided games or isolating two-on-one inside, and you rehearse it over and over again until you improve those aspects of the decision-making that weren't so good in that situation. And again, that's back to our games-based approach to training, not the drills, but looking at real situations that happen in every game and trying to improve them by engaging with the players, getting their feedback, asking the questions, and then you as coaches intervening when appropriate with your expertise. That's fine. On the subject of skills, I'm going to be a little bit more radical here now and suggest to you that if you want to make a big gain, marginal gain, in one particular area, it's in the area of hand passing or fist passing. I played Aussie rules a number of years ago for a couple of years, and the very first thing that struck me in training was how much emphasis was being placed on the correct technique or correct technical skill development, and also on bilateral development. In other words, been as good at the right hand as and the left, and left foot, right foot, left foot as well. And when I was introduced to the fist passing technique over there, it actually felt, even at the first session I remember, feeling so much more natural than our own technique. And so much so that when I came back, I used it for the remainder of my football career, and I also coach it to any young players that I'm coaching. And there's a few reasons why I prefer the technique, and if we can run this one on, thanks. The Aussie rules technique here, as you can see, is to fist the ball. You can see where they're fisting it. It's the four-finger V, if you like. And when they bring back the arm, the elbow, when you have that type of technique as opposed to that technique, you can generate, it's more compact, you can generate a lot more power in the ball. The trajectory of the ball goes very straight, and it's more reliable in terms of accuracy. Now, Here's in contrast the GA one. And it's a subtle difference, but you can see there's an extra movement. You've got to open your body first and then bring back the arm. And when you bring back the arm, and try this afterwards if you don't believe me, when you bring back the arm, it creates a natural arc or a pendulum motion. And when you bring it back, and when you hit the ball, what happens? That creates a loop. And the ball goes slower as a result. So what we'll do here in a second is we'll have a look at an international rules clip. We'll have a look at it there again. You see how compact it is and how sharp the movement is? Because when you bring back the elbow, when your arm is in that position, you can create a straight line trajectory once you hit the ball, as opposed to, as I said, our one, which creates that loop. And with that straight line trajectory, it's more powerful, gets to the target quicker. Thanks. Okay, thank you. So we'll have a look at, those of you who have watched international rules over the years, I'm sure have been aware or have seen the fact that the Aussies, even in fisting the round ball with very limited training or very limited time, can do it in many ways more effectively, in many cases more effectively than our best players. And to me, it's all down to the technique. So we might have just a look at an example from the 2014 Test match in Perth.
Anywhere near Chad Wingard in this third term, he just seems to have so much space.
And while you're watching, just notice the pace of the fist passes, the accuracy.
Definitely. We're seeing Cameron, we've seen a reverse of last year.
Two-handed bilateral as well.
The lack of marking an Aussie player is evident, whereas last year it was the Aussies.
How they evade the tackle, got the ball away, very comfortable either side of the body.
Back to Jack.
And the final one that I want you to note here is the one where the player fists the ball over his head. I think it comes shortly here. There it is.
Well, you can kick backwards, but it won't be the mark allowed.
That was the last one. Okay, thanks very much. All right. So the last one there where the ball was fisted over the head, because in our game, as we all know, we often see players been surrounded by 3 and 4 players in the field of play. Oh, yeah, we got this. Yeah, that should go back to there's a good kind of comparison of the two fist passes in action. See the player on the left, very compact. See his elbow straight back. See the player on the right, it's the open fist. It's a much more, I suppose, languid, open style. You would assume the guy on the left might hit the target a bit easier than the guy on the right. Okay. Yeah, we see this situation happen very often in Gaelic football. Player surrounded by 3 or 4. And what typically happens? Player goes to ground, goes down and tries to shovel the ball out with a hand pass through the legs or to a teammate. Now, we saw in the previous clip, the Aussies, when they were tackled, they got the hands up and they fisted away. Their technique allows them to do that more easily than our technique. And the reason why we can't do that is that, number one, if you want to hand pass it, you're not allowed to do it because the rule says the hand passing motion, the open hand, must be underhand. So you can't do it like that, free against you. And if you want to try and do it with the traditional fist pass, you won't generate the power, that sharp movement. You won't generate that power and accuracy. So with the other technique, you'll be able to do that. And maybe that's, again, a marginal gain that you could get in the preparation of your team. So going back to the international rules clip again, we see how good they are. All right. It's okay. We see how good they are every year. The media always write about it, say their hand passing is fantastic, better than ours, fist passing, even with limited exposure to the round ball. Those of us who have played the game prefer it as a technique. Yet it hasn't taken on here. And I don't understand why it hasn't really taken on here. But all I'm saying to you that if you have a team and you're working on for the next 2 or 3 years and you're looking for a marginal gain in your hand passing, your fist passing technique to try and move the ball faster, swifter, create opportunities better, more reliable, hitting the target, well then maybe it's an area that you could consider devoting some time to in your preparations. So just to conclude and summarise my philosophy on developing the player, and it's probably no different to the other speakers beforehand. First of all, have the player as the focus, centre of every development plan, of every coaching plan for the year. Player being at the centre. The second thing is consider a development coordinator. It's like everything else. If you what's the old saying? You measure what you manage, or what is it? What gets measured gets done, isn't it? What gets measured gets done. So if you have a plan for the player at the start of the year, and you have somebody who's assessing it, managing it, coordinating it, it's more likely to improve. To develop the player as a whole, not isolated, not just working the drills, you can develop the player through the games-based situations in all 4 areas. I think the other thing is, and that we've learned so many times, take time with the player. They develop at different stages of their cycle. And if you put time and belief into a player, I think your confidence in him is likely to be rewarded over time. Back to the games-based, small-sided games. Keep challenging the players in those games-based situations in training, because that provides them with the very best learning opportunity. They will learn better in that environment, and they will enjoy it more. And the final thing I'd say to you is to aim to make it as fun, interesting, challenging and enjoyable for the players, but equally as important for yourselves, because as coaches, if you're putting in 15 to 20 to 30 hours a week into coaching your team and preparing your team, make sure you enjoy it as well. Thanks very much.